Welcome. This is a short film I've made about the future of World of Tanks, the Xbox version that is. And what it consists of is it consists of an examination of player data from the Xbox version of the game and the discussion of its relevance to the community. Now, I should probably introduce myself. My name's Dr. Bodge. If you're a regular on the forum, you may have come across some of my posts. And this video it's a bringing together really a number of things I've posted on the forum about the size and health of the player base in Xbox version of World of Tanks. Now, why does this matter? Well, this is a free-to-play game. It relies on us choosing or to invest our money in the game, and I think it's relevant to us as customers what the position, what the future of the game is. I did feel a bit of an ethical dilemma when I was deciding whether or not to make my analysis of the data public. But first of all, I felt that the customers, the community are customers and they have a right to know this information. It is public information after all. And secondly, Wargaming will have been aware of these patterns. They should have been aware of these patterns, 18 months, 2 years ago. And so they've had plenty of opportunity to make any strategic decisions they need in the light of this information. So I'd like to talk first about a little bit about the source of the data. Now, this data first I became aware of it in a post by Gigantic Owl a few weeks back, and he in turn had referenced a Reddit post by Kamikaze Russia. Now, what Kamikaze Russia had done is he'd identified a new source of information. He'd taken the high score tables on the Wargaming portal, and this lists all the players who've played the game, unique individuals who played the game since its launch. And he then furthermore identified the player IDs and looked at the player records on the console API. You should all be familiar with the World of Tanks portal. This is where you'll look up your own personal data or the data of any other player. So if we take a random player name and look at them, you can see this contains fairly basic information about what the player's done, how many battles they've played, how many they've won, that kind of thing. And we can go further. If you click this orange button over here, it'll actually show where this player ranks in the Hall of Fame by a number of different criteria. And there they are. Yep. And if you look at the criteria at the bottom, you'll see that anybody who's played at least 100 battles since account creation will show up in this Hall of Fame. And what Kamikaze Russia has done is he's identified all the players in this high score table and has looked up more details about them using the console API. For those of you who haven't seen it, this is what the console API looks like. It's a set of tools that enable you to access the personal data that Wargaming hold on the players. So if I select over, I can select the realm. I want to pick up Xbox Live because that's the data we're interested in. And if we search for a player, if we take the player we're just looking at, we can send a request and it'll give us very, very basic information from the player list. But in this list we can take the account ID and then we can search for the player's personal data using their account ID. So pop that in there and run the request again. And this time we get a lot more information. Most of this is the stuff that will appear on the main page for a player. But what's useful here is right at the end you'll have this here, which is a timestamp saying when the account was created, and another one here saying when the last battle time was. And it's this data that we're using to identify the new incoming players and when players have finished, left the game. So I looked at the data and I concluded that even though there are some anomalies, it seems to be a pretty accurate source of information. There are relatively few complaints by players on the forum about the accuracy of the player data in the portal. And if I've observed one thing over the years, it's that if there is anything wrong, it will get complained about pretty quickly. The data is limited in the sense that it only includes players who played over 100 games, but really 100 games isn't very many, so anybody who has taken the game at all seriously will appear in that data. Now, Wargaming have claimed that this data is inaccurate, but they haven't given any further details about that. They've simply claimed that our data source is not reliable. Now, even though the data source is, I see the data source as a reasonably reliable one, I always feel it's worth performing some data validation of your own. And first of all, I checked my own data, and I found that it appeared to be a pretty accurate reflection of my record. I then checked a couple of, a dozen forum regulars, and all of them seemed to be fairly accurately representing the data. I went further. I checked, a dozen or so randomly chosen ID numbers, and they were all present. Certain players have made me aware of small anomalies in the data, but certainly at the kind of vehicle level. But I don't think these should influence the robustness of the overall findings. So I'd first like to present a rather superficial overview of the data before going into some elements in a little bit more depth. The first thing we were able to do is we were able to look at the account numbers. Now, the account numbers are assigned incrementally, and we found that something like just under 12 million player accounts had been created. And this suggests that Wargaming have done a pretty good job in terms of attracting new players to the game. So anybody who has set up an account, who's downloaded the game and set up an account, will appear on this record. And considering that estimates of the Xbox Live usage running sort of 40-50 million, this is a pretty sizable proportion of that, suggesting that at least on an advertising and marketing level, Wargaming have done a pretty good job in attracting players. When you look at the distribution of these recruits across the life cycle of the game, unsurprisingly, the majority joined in the very early days, and then you saw a drop off in numbers as we moved over the next year. Now, there's a peak in the middle of the graph, and this represents when the Xbox One version of the game launched, and then once again you see the number of new recruits starting to tail off. And this is not unusual. You'd expect to see something like this, and it certainly appears that the launch of the Xbox One version increased the number of players joining the game. However, the number of accounts created is not necessarily a particularly good reflection of the number of people actually playing the game. If we look here, we can see that the number of people who actually get as far as reaching 100 games is only really a very small proportion of the people who actually create accounts. And so it's not necessarily a good idea to rely too much on the number of account IDs when concluding the health of the game. So now we can look at things in a little bit more detail. When we look at the number of players actually reaching 100 games, the situation isn't quite as rosy. We see the numbers falling over time, and this trend has been stable over a number of years. So even though it appeared that the launch of the Xbox One increased the number of people creating accounts, it didn't have a very big effect on the number of people actually reaching 100 games. And we can see now that the current intake, the green line here, is actually only a very small fraction at this time of year of what we were getting this time last year, which is slightly worrying. And part of this is down to the falling recruitment, but a lot of it is also down to a significant collapse in attachment rates. In the early cohort, were a very high proportion of players are reaching, the 100 games, like I said, 25% or so in the first cohort, and this has generally fallen. And this green bar in the middle indicates when the Xbox One launched, and this has represented, like I said, a collapse really in the attachment rates, and it continues to fall. And retention rates are very important because it means we're seeing an increase in the rate at which players are being lost. Again, the green bar represents when the Xbox One launched, version of the game launched, and you can see since then there's been quite a noticeable rise in the rate at which players are leaving. Now, I've already identified that the number of new players joining the game is falling, but the number of players leaving is rising. So when you have that kind of situation where players in is falling and players out is rising, eventually the number of players leaving is going to be higher the rate at which they leave is going to be higher than the rate at which new players join. And you can see that this happens. The green line is players joining, the red line is people leaving, and you can see about July 2015, this is when the players were actually for the first time leaving the game faster than they were joining it. And you'd expect then that the size of the player base to start to fall. And indeed, this is what we see here. When we plot the size of the player base, you can see that it peaked in about that, July 2015. And the fall since then has been quite significant, not precipitous, but certainly significant. And we're down to now only about 60% of that peak figure. Now, the number of players we currently see online at any point in time is about 65,000 on the Xbox, and this is down from about 100,000 2 years ago. This seems a pretty healthy figure, and you'd think that was suggested the game was pretty safe. And indeed it is a good number, but you've got to bear in mind that not all of these 65,000 are online at the same time. Now, in analysis of Kamikaze's data, it suggests that the average player plays only around once a week for around 25 games, so approximately 3 hours, 1 day a week. That's the average across everybody. So if you want a game to be playable for say 15 hours a day, from first thing in the morning through to midnight, this means, when you take into account the fact each player will only be playing for a small portion of that, it means the average number of players online at any given point in time will probably be closer to 13,000 rather than 65,000. Across all versions of the Xbox game. And the problem with it, if matchmaking is to work efficiently, it actually needs quite a lot of people playing. Now, you must bear in mind these calculations are not intended to be precise. They're just a kind of really vague estimate to give you some kind of a feel of the scale of things. Those players need to be split across 3 servers, and if the matchmaking is to work well and to give you a good spread of matches, that you need 10 tiers worth of tanks represented. And if you consider the average game maybe is say 8 minutes, for instance, again this is all just rule of thumb, then that means at any given point in time, if you only want to be in the queue for less than a minute, you need at least 8 games running simultaneously. So what that means is you actually need to deliver that sort of smooth matchmaking experience that we know and love, you need about sort of 7,500 players online at any given point in time. When you bear in mind that we've just said that currently, you shouldn't expect more than 13,000. This figure is only over half the current figure, and so it does give you an indication that if the server numbers continue to drop, then it might not be all that long before we start to see problems showing up in matchmaking. Now, at this point, you might expect me to make some kind of predictions about what I think is going to happen in the future. But I'd first like to add a warning that forecasting is particularly difficult business in whatever field you're in. And I wouldn't pretend that we can say with any degree of precision what's likely to happen. However, if we assume that the kind of trends we've seen over the last year or two persist, and there's no reason to think they wouldn't, then we could reach sort of a lower level of player base within anything from 6 to 18 months. This is, of course, assuming that Wargaming don't intervene in some way to correct it. And the game won't collapse at this point. You're not suddenly going to log in the morning and the game's going to be gone. What'll happen is the game will just simply start to function less effectively, and probably most notably through matchmaking. You'll find at certain times of the day, certain tiers, the matchmaking will simply not be capable of quickly putting you into a good match. Also, we might see Wargaming changing direction. We might see them reducing investment in the game, certainly making no long-term investments. We could expect to see price rises, and most worrying would be if we started to see, obviously pay-to-win features appearing in the game. And one of the things that's worried me in the past, and I think worry a lot of people, is that they feel that some of these symptoms are already starting to show up. And I think that's why there's concern about the future of the game. Well, what next? Well, we'll continue to keep an eye on the data. I'm aware Mr. Crowley is collecting figures on the active size of the player base, and I guess we'll just have to wait and see what happens. Again, if people like this video, then maybe I'll produce another one looking at the player retention rate in a little bit more detail. But other than that, well, thank you for watching, and goodbye.